Hello everyone and welcome. From my Muslim family and friends, Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you. This is my coming out message, so to speak. No, not that kind of coming out. Today is actually about a different kind of coming out. It's about religion and making conscious choices. It's about something that I've kept quiet about for the better part of 20 years. You see, I was born into a denomination of Islam called Ahmadiyyat. I have, however, left Ahmadiyyat. I have also, in fact, left Islam. I've left all religions altogether. I did so long ago, but have only recently begun to formalize it and talk about this choice, which I and countless others have made, but often shy away from vocalizing. Today, I'm going to tell you why people leave and why I've left. Or should I say, I'm going to give you just a little preview. But know this, I didn't leave the positive values that I was raised with, nor have I left the Muslim people that I've grown up with and whom I love. You might be thinking, people leave their inherited religions all the time. They don't create coming out videos about it. They just move on with their lives. Why don't you just keep this to yourself? Well, my answer to that question is that I hope that we do get to see a world where the repercussions for leaving Islam, even in the West, are as benign as they are for leaving Christianity. But we're not there yet. If you're a non-Muslim, you probably don't hear much about people leaving Islam, because most people, in order to maintain good relations with family and friends, have to keep it quiet. Or they have to pretend to be nominal, liberal, or deficient Muslims. It's rather insulting to human dignity to have to live inauthentically, to protect our loved ones from the gossip and the perceptions of small-minded people in their religious communities. To upend the status quo, we have to normalize dissent. This video is my small contribution towards that very effort. I hope that in a few short years, such vocal proclamations of non-belief in Islam will be completely unnecessary. But in 2019, we're not there yet. Without fail, most liberal and moderate Muslim families still plead with their loved ones, please keep your apostasy private. What are people going to say? Or in Urdu, log kya kahenge? As a result, a huge proportion of young people, and many not so young, keep as a secret their most fundamental convictions about religion. They allow others to assume and project a false identity onto their persons, just to save face. Living muzzled in this way is inauthentic. It's corrosive and it's unfair, and it has to stop. And the way to fix this is to normalize disbelief in one's inherited religion, whichever religion that may be. Today, I'm sharing a message of authenticity. And in this message, there is love and there is gratitude for people who still hold religious beliefs that I myself no longer do. I don't want those of us who question and who leave Islam to have to choose between our families and our authenticity, our autonomy, or our dignity. My message is one of rejecting racism and of rejecting bigotry, especially the soft bigotry of low expectations. My message is about questioning beliefs as we stay mindful of the fact that ideas do not have rights. Only people do. People have the right to believe or not to believe. All of us have the right to profess our positions and to evangelize for them, whether in favor of a religion or as critical of one. The primary audience for this video are people who have grown up as Muslims or who have at one point converted to Islam. In particular, my specific focus is directed at Ahmadi Muslims, with whom I share a background. Whether you're questioning or hadn't even begun to question yet, this message is for you. I'll also close with advice for my fellow ex-Muslims in general. Namely, that despite provocation and misrepresentation of our positions, it is important that we dialogue on these highly charged topics from a place of love and compassion, even if these same gestures of kindness have not been extended to us. In this coming out series of videos, I'm going to tell you a bit about my story with Islam. In my journey, Ahmadiyyat was the lens through which I had originally learnt, studied, and lived Islam. I began to seriously question at the age of 19, after reflecting upon verses in the Qur'an where women are treated differently than men. Inheritance, guardianship, divorce protocol, physical discipline, and so on. Having grown up in Canada, I actually first looked into these controversial verses so that I could become more effective in preaching the message of Islam to a Western audience. I was about 25 years old at the time, and I didn't make nor did I take this decision lightly. When I posed my theological questions in writing, the religious leadership could not produce a written response or even a rebuttal in spoken conversation. My questions were read, acknowledged, and then simply ignored. Now, even before that time, back when I was a teenager and had first started questioning, we did our research with printed books and trips to the library. This was all well before Google was the de facto resource that it is today. After a few years of having left Islam, I did actually try to rekindle my religious convictions. Why, you might ask? Well, because I longed for community and that turnkey sense of having almost everything laid out for you. As human beings, we also crave structure and we gravitate toward ready-made answers, even if they're wrong. Few of us are truly comfortable embracing the unknown or admitting that we don't have definitive answers for some of life's biggest questions. And it's okay to say that we don't know, especially with the big questions. It's a more honest answer in which there is no shame. In fact, such courage and such honesty should be celebrated. The time to believe in religious claims is after the evidence has come in for those claims. Let's not believe in religious claims until then. To do so is to allow ourselves to be fooled. It is to naively reward acting on emotional hunches propped up by flawed reasoning in favor of a number of cognitive biases that we humans are prone to. Is God rewarding us for succumbing to such cognitive human biases not borne out by reason and objectively verifiable truths? Did a religious leader tell an infertile couple in your community that God would bless them with a child after being childless for 12 years? Did the subsequent birth of a child to this couple increase your faith? What becomes of all of the other prophetic-sounding statements that this same person has made over the last 20 years, which you've not been privy to? How's their batting average compared to the rate of chance? Who's keeping track of all of their prophetic-sounding statements that went nowhere? Do you brush these failures aside with the exasperated retort, "Only Allah knows"? Please realize that we human beings have a cognitive bias toward remembering the outcomes which confirm our existing beliefs. Anecdotes like these rely on a combination of selective memory and confirmation biases, say nothing of the opportunity to embellish undocumented stories retold after the fact. During my own return to Islam, I had rationalized that if I was the only one who was questioning the theology, then perhaps I was missing some insight that everyone else had. I mean, no one else seemed to have these questions, or so I thought. I'll set my doubts aside, I counseled myself. I'll just focus on the parts of the religion that resonated with me. And with that, I returned to prayer as earnestly as I could. Returning to religion, I thought, perhaps I wouldn't have to feel so alone anymore. I could re-engage with community again. Perhaps I'd also recapture that blissful religious conviction that I once had and which I missed. And so, for a few years, I did actually return to a belief in Ahmadiyya Islam, albeit in a contrived and compartmentalized fashion. The motivation was to have community, and as best as I could, to be congruent with the religion in doing so. Without community, there seemed to be a learned helplessness in navigating life, where one has to rebuild their social network, and where one has to recalibrate their expectations of the networks they might be able to build on their own. These difficulties are especially profound when you've grown up in a tight-knit religious community like that of the Ahmadiyya Muslims. Here, you've got what is effectively 3 degrees of separation across the world. I know that people from mainstream Muslim backgrounds are likely not going to understand, but that, for example, people from a Jehovah's Witness background most definitely will. You cannot easily replace deep friendships and relationships from childhood nurtured over decades. Losing acceptance and stepping out of an ecosystem of social relations where everyone seems to know everyone else, that's hard. The community aspect, when it works, is wonderful. And oftentimes, letting go of religion is a process. Notwithstanding all of the incentives to stay, I just couldn't manage the cognitive dissonance any longer. I was in my early 30s, and I finally had to let go of Islam. This time, for real. At once, I was both ex-Ahmadi and ex-Muslim. And by the way, you should know that the term ex-Muslim is just a synonym for former Muslim. It does not mean anti-Muslim. Far from it, in fact. Myself and many of the ex-Muslims that I've come to know, we all love Muslims. We come from Muslim families that we still very much love. And this is a big part of why we critique Islam. We want to help free the people that we love. We hope to make the world a better place by softening the uncompromising position that many Muslims have been conditioned into from birth. Many Muslims are reluctant to think independently about faith or even to question. Now, since leaving Islam, I've not embraced any other religion, nor is it my intention to do so. I'll always keep an open mind, of course, but I've already surveyed other religious belief systems, and I've not found any of them to be convincing. You can read more about the specific labels that I employ in a treatise which I've written for this purpose. It's called My Beliefs. You'll find a link to that piece in the description box accompanying this video. In brief, I can very much empathize with the intuitions held by the religious that there's a grand design and a creator for our universe, for existence itself. But while there are very good arguments challenging these same popular notions put forth by theism, such metaphysical speculation isn't actually my focus. Now, don't get me wrong, I do enjoy dabbling in these discussions from time to time. But my own focus is on religion itself, the history, the prophets, the claims, and their teachings. And that's because I believe that there are even stronger grounds to conclude that the religions which we have today, all of them, well, they all fall short when we carefully examine their truth claims, their scriptures, their prophecies, and their assertions, especially their claims of superior moral guidance. Since I come from an Ahmadi Muslim background, you should know that I see Ahmadiyyat as a sugar-coated version of Islam. I talk more about this in my newly released essay, Lessons Learned on Community and Dissent. In short, I believe that Ahmadiyyat, recognizing the unpalatable baggage in early Islamic source material, had to engage in a major cherry-picking operation with a large serving of historical revisionism in order to arrive at a mostly softer version of Islam. As for that nice rhetoric that you've heard from recent khulafa of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, well, that doesn't change what the source texts of Islam have to say. And these same khulafa have said some questionable things themselves about the role and disposition of women in order to defend verses of the Qur'an, which, for example, allow a husband to physically beat his wife merely when he fears disobedience that hasn't even happened yet. Yes, I know beating is the third escalation step in a series of 3 steps, and there are several hadiths which advise men to treat their wives with kindness. I address verse 434 of the Quran in my aforementioned treatise, where you can see me unpack some of the typical Islamic apologetics with a fresh perspective, tying in notions of our justified expectations for divine scripture. Finally, the writings and prophecies of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad also contain some troubling passages. I've also found some major problems with prophecies whose fulfillment is highly questionable, such as Mirza Ghulam Ahmad's lifespan prophecy. For more on that front, I refer you to Nuzhat Hanif's 2004 book, Recognizing the Messiah. She's a former Ahmadi Muslim and a former Musi at that. In short, what good I do see in Ahmadiyya Islam, I believe, is simply the phenomena that most believers are better than their scriptures, and that organizational cohesion and obedience to a Khalifa means that his revisionist message simply carries more weight than an actual and authentic reading of the underlying scriptures which claim to be revered by Ahmadi adherents. But I care about what is true, and not merely how well something has been sugarcoated for wider consumption. One of the reasons why I am stepping forward today is because I want Muslims to know that ex-Muslims are not your enemies. We've been among you for a very long time. Our lives are often intertwined with yours, far more than many of you might even realize. We've taken a different path on theological beliefs, sure, but at a social level, most of us are still very much a part of your communities. Many of us still show up at the mosque to pay our respects to elders in the community who have passed. We don't create a scene there. I myself have attended funeral prayers for many loved ones over several years, all the while having secretly been one of Islam's non-believers. I stand in silence alongside my Muslim brethren in solidarity, remembering the deceased as they had wished to be remembered. A small gesture on my part to honor their wishes. I too grieve when worshippers at a mosque have been gunned down, whether, for example, an Ahmadi Muslim mosque in Pakistan or a mainstream Muslim mosque right here in my own country of Canada. I also sometimes pick up my niece from Sunday school at the mosque. When I do, I give my salams to familiar faces with a warm voice and a heartfelt smile. I help set up the audio system and record the video of religious ceremonies that my family members hold when their children finish reading the Qur'an. I help my dad reformat prayer timetables for easier posting on the refrigerator door. I go and fetch prayer mats and prayer caps when family comes over to visit and it's prayer time. And I do all of this with a smile. I even give Eid gifts to little kids in my family so that I get to take part in their happiness on Eid. For several years consecutively, I even ran the blood drive at a national convention of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in the USA, all the while secretly having been one of Islam's non-believers. There are even times where I find myself on the same wavelength as some conservative Muslims on the odd issue. I, for example, still don't drink alcohol. It's one of the values from Islam that I've retained and which I personally feel quite strongly about. But don't worry, I won't be offended if you have a drink in front of me, even if you're a Muslim. It's about live and let live. Now, this eclectic mix of values has certainly complicated my own personal life, as I don't neatly fit into any well-subscribed category. Most other ex-Muslims, each in their own way, don't either. And so here's the key takeaway on coexistence with Muslims who promote peace and pluralism. My dear Muslims, ex-Muslims are not your enemies. To us, you are brothers and sisters in humanity. We still love you as we know deep down you still love us. Religion should not come between us. As someone whose life was so much easier when I professed belief in Islam, it was a painful process when I engaged with Islam's source material honestly. Take, for example, the Qur'an, Islam's most important document. I used to believe in the so-called scientific miracles of the Qur'an. I now understand that far from concordance with science, the Qur'an merely reflects the scientific inaccuracies of its time. You have to go rummaging through the roots of Arabic words to find a connotation that you'd like to cherry pick, and then you have to proclaim that this reflects on a hidden meaning. One has to attribute such hidden meanings after the fact to verses which on the surface plainly reflect 7th century misconceptions. There's plenty of evidence for my position, which is critical of the alleged science in the Quran. Today, there are even mainstream Muslim preachers who advocate against the position that there are any scientific miracles in the Quran, including the supposedly miraculous description of embryology. Muslim preachers have been roundly embarrassed by modern embryologists when trying to push this narrative. Watch the full video I linked to in the description box, and you'll see what I mean. In the next clip, you'll see Dr. Khalid Montasar giving an interview to Sky News Arabia on April 20th, 2018. Dr. Khalid Montasar is the author of a book which in English translates to The Illusion of the Scientific Miraculous Nature of the Quran. He is a native Arabic speaker. He understands how to look up meanings for Arabic roots from Arabic lexicons and dictionaries, and he's not buying it. Remember, the vast majority of Ahmadi Muslims are not native Arabic speakers. They learn from materials produced by the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat which confirm their own unique minority view of Islamic theology. It was mainstream Muslims who popularized the scientific miracles, not Ahmadiyya Islam. And it is they who are now abandoning that narrative, while Ahmadiyyat has yet to catch up. And now I give you Dr. Khalid Montasar.
الإعجاز العلمي وهما كبيرا يضر الدين ويضر العلم أيضا. قضية الإعجاز العلمي كانت مخدر ومسكن جميل للعرب وللمسلمين أنهم تفوقوا. نحن المتفوقون، نحن الأعظم، نحن الأفضل. يعني هذا اختراع بشري لمن أحس بالدونية ولمن أحس بالفجوة العميقة بينه وبين الغرب. إيه الحل؟ الحل هو أن أقول أن كل شيء كان موجودا ويخترع هو موجود عندي فعلا في القرآن وفي الحديث.
In the blog post that accompanies this video, I linked to several resources which I encourage all of you to explore, especially the video playlist dealing with these scientific miracle claims. I would also suggest that you read the book, My Ordeal with the Quran, if you believe that the Quran is, or even might be, a miraculous piece of literature. I especially encourage Ahmadi Muslim viewers to read this book, since most Ahmadi Muslims do not even speak Arabic, and thus they've never been able to really engage with the original scripture. Had they ever wanted at some point in their lives to explore the book in a critical way for themselves, that opportunity now exists. My Ordeal with the Quran and Allah in the Quran was written by Abbas Abdul Noor and translated from Arabic into English by Hassan Radwan. The author was born in Damanhur, Egypt in 1927. He was a Sufi sheikh and a pious Muslim who studied at Al-Azhar in the Faculty of Theology. He eventually studied at the Sorbonne in Paris, where he obtained a doctorate in philosophy. Here's but one excerpt I'd like to read for you from Abbas Abdul Noor's book. From page 205 to 206, we have verses that have no meaning. In the Qur'an, there are a significant number of verses that have no meaning, even though, as usual, the Mufassirun are able to bring about wonders with their waffling and prattling and defense of the meaningless, producing one eloquent meaning after another. They are motivated by the ideology of justifying anything and everything in the Qur'an, to the extent that the crooked verses become pearls of wisdom, fonts of knowledge, the source of eloquence, and the template for good style, which man cannot attain. By those ranged in ranks, then those who drive away with reproof, and those who recite a reminder, lo, your Lord is surely one. Quran, chapter 37, verses 1 through 4. What do the first three verses mean? Nay, these three riddles? And what do they have to do with the oneness of God? Did you understand anything? I challenge man and jinn to understand these verses. To me, such Quranic verses remind me of the deepities that Dan Dennett had coined. You can read more about those in My Beliefs, a Treatise. This video is not a treatise on why Islam is false, but I do want sincere Muslims who are watching to consider what they've been taught were the reasons for why Islam spread so rapidly. This is important because many of us grow up thinking, well, if over 1 billion people believe in this religion, who am I to question it? So let's put the world's large Muslim population into perspective. Today, we see some of Islam's critics claiming that Islam spread by the sword. At the same time, most Muslims and Islamic apologists suggest instead that all wars fought by the expanding Islamic empire were defensive in nature, and that Islam spread because it appealed to the hearts and minds of the conquered and liberated nations. Perusing history, we find a more nuanced narrative. Islam's spread cannot be attributed to the world at large being forced at the sharp edge of a sword one by one. That didn't happen. But we do know that Muslim armies had successively taken over more and more territory of the then known world for the simple sake of expansion. Yes, even in the time of the Khulafa Rashidin, as Sunni and Ahmadi Muslims would refer to the first 4 caliphs of Islam. The new state apparatus would then favor Islam over other religions. These other religions were, for the most part, allowed to coexist, sure, albeit under very specific provisions.
Now, whatever is the case about the time of the Prophet, there is simply no denying that the Khulafa al-Rashidun and the Umayyads engaged in offensive conquest of other lands. The Sassanid Empire did not pose any immediate threat. They were not attacking the Muslims at all. In fact, as we will study, when the Muslims attacked the Sassanid Empire, Rustum said, "What are you guys doing here? Why are you attacking us? I mean, we're not bothering you. What are you doing over here?" Remember, that was the famous, we'll get to that conversation today and next time as well. And the Romans as well couldn't care less about the Arabs. Remember, we said this from the very beginning. Both the Romans and the Persians, or I should say the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire, that's the more precise term, they were minding their own business, fighting each other. And they were not fighting the Arabs at the time because they didn't see any strategic advantage in controlling the Arabs. The Arabs were not a civilization that offered anything to them, and they didn't care about oil back then, right? Unlike now. So there was no reason for them to invade. If they had wanted to invade, there could have been no stopping them before the coming of Islam. But there was no reason for them. Now that Islam has conquered and is solidified, there was still no immediate reason for them to invade. There's no threat at all. And yet Abu Bakr as-Siddiq sent armies of tens of thousands of people. And Umar ibn Khattab followed suit. And the same goes when Umar ibn Khattab sent Amr ibn al-As into Egypt. Egypt was not sending any army into Arabia. And Amr ibn al-As with 4,000 people said, give me 4,000 people, I will give you Alexandria, which was the capital of that region. I'll give you Alexandria. Why? What was Alexandria doing to the Muslims? Nothing. So the claim that, oh, all of this is a defensive battle, frankly, it's not proven by anything. And it goes against common sense. Why would you send tens of thousands of people when there's no threat at all? And the fact of the matter, therefore, there is simply no denying this. And the same goes, by the way, even for our lands of India, of Sindh, Makran. And they established the Umayyad.
The book In God's Path by Robert G. Hoyland relates how people in these conquered lands were not forced to convert. Like most people, they were pragmatic and didn't take too kindly to paying more taxes than other people in the land. You see, generally speaking, Muslims in these early conquests enjoyed paying fewer taxes than the non-Muslim subjects of these conquered lands. Here are some excerpts from Robert Hoyland's book with location references given in the description box. Differential taxation. The Arab conquerors would probably have wished that things stayed that way, themselves living a life of luxury at the expense of the conquered. Inevitably, however, many of the latter sought to get a share of the immense privileges enjoyed by the conquerors, in particular, release from taxes. Fiscal agents for Hajjaj complained again and again that the tax revenue has diminished, for the conquered people have become Muslims and gone off to the garrison cities. One group that we hear a lot about in the papyri of the late 7th and early 8th centuries are peasants who had fallen behind with their taxes and left their land in the hope of escaping their plight by conversion. Muslim revolts and the fall of the Umayyads. Though they may have been necessary, these reforms to the tax system stoked resentment against the Umayyads. Many different groups felt that they had lost out, in particular, local elites and recent converts to Islam. Recent and would-be converts to Islam, especially low-status individuals, often encountered hostility from the authorities and were frequently denied the exemption from poll tax that they had been promised when they converted. When Ushrus realized that a consequence of his policy was a sharp drop in tax revenues, he ordered, "Take the tax from whomever you used to take it from." And so they reimposed the poll tax on those who had become Muslim, prompting many to apostatize. Paying more taxes as non-Muslims made these people more inclined to convert, if only in name, to remove themselves from the burden of these higher taxes. As soon as Muhammad died, Abu Bakr took a year to fight the Ridda Wars, i.e., the wars of apostasy, as many had revolted and had left the fold of Islam. Here again, we see that the early Islamic Ummah wasn't about heartfelt religious belief. A large part of what was going on here was political. It had to do with alliances and taxation. If you were an Ahmadi Muslim and went to Sunday school, all of the Ijtimas and all of the Jalsa Salana conventions, ask yourself if you've ever heard of this disparate taxation levied on non-Muslims in these early conquests and how that incentivized the non-Muslim populations in those lands to convert. Then ask yourself, why is it that we haven't heard of these facts regarding early Islamic history? Consider how these nominal conversions to reduce the burden of taxation play out after just a couple of generations in nations with pro-Islamic state apparatus. Is it any wonder that a child raised Muslim, even by nominal Muslim parents, but receiving Islamic education from the state from a young age, will grow up emotionally imprinted with the beliefs attached to their now Muslim identity? Reflect on this first generation of nominal Muslims. Their children are being taught Islam at religious schools. This first generation of parents may have only identified as Muslims for the statutory benefits, including favorable tax relief. But soon, when you fast forward through a couple of generations, you now have a population of believers because of the entanglement of identity and lifelong societal indoctrination. It's no different than the simple observation that most people who are raised as Christians are more likely to follow Christianity. Most people who are born Hindu are not likely to be practicing Islam in their adulthood. Your ancestors. If today you are a born Muslim, might you have been influenced to be so because of your parents and their parents before them? Perhaps many generations back, someone in your family too was simply trying to avoid discriminatory taxation. Congratulations, you now carry the label and perhaps even the belief that your religion is true. Aristotle commented on the power of childhood indoctrination, on imprinting values, character, and belief on impressionable young minds. Give me a child until he is 7, and I will show you the man. Ask yourselves, what percentage of Seventh-day Adventist Christians become Shia Muslims? What percentage of Salafi Muslims convert to Ahmadiyya Islam? The pattern is patently obvious, no? Most people do not choose their religion. It is nurtured into them from childhood. And so making a truly objective evaluation of a religion's truth claims for the religion one was born into is exceedingly unlikely. I recall once sitting in a gathering, it was prayer in fact, of Ahmadi Muslim adult males, and the topic of the then Khalifa's big preaching push had come up. Mirza Tahir Ahmed wanted each Ahmadi Muslim to bring in at least one new Ahmadi Muslim convert that year. The figure might have even been higher than that, but I don't recall. In any event, and more to the point, one Ahmadi Muslim in the group mentioned that he was covered this year, since he had just had a baby. He had created a new Ahmadi Muslim for the Jamaat. The implications of this man's innocent statement struck me, and they stuck with me. Implicitly, we all know that the greatest predictor of a child's future religion is the religion into which they've been raised. Yet, how many people truly evaluate the religious claims of their own inherited religion? Do you think reading literature from the Jalsa Salana bookstall is going to give you an objective and critical take on Islam? You're no different than the born Christian reaffirming their faith by reading Christian literature, debunking Islam and affirming the wisdom of Christianity. Perhaps your faith is strengthened by a charismatic Murabbi in the
And then
Jamaat.
when she came to Jalsa in 2016, and Huzur, now in between, she just wanted to make sure that this happens. So when she was told that Huzur says, I'll pray for you, and then she wrote a letter to Huzur saying, Huzur, give me a name, suggest a name for the boy.
Consider how your faith in Christianity would have been similarly strengthened by a no less charismatic and caring pastor had you grown up in the church.
To serve you, and I know you've gifted.
A related problem arises when religious people, and this of course includes Ahmadi Muslims, begin exploring comparative religion with a desired conclusion in mind. This is a dishonest method of inquiry. This is not the journey of truth seekers. It is a journey for confirmation bias seekers. These adherents want to gather confirming evidence for the conclusion that they already wish to reinforce. A conclusion that lets them maintain the happy status quo with the family and the community with whom they had grown up. This is an exercise in feeling good, not one of confronting and seeking out hard truths. For many years, I've been quiet about my non-belief in Islam. I was concerned about the social repercussions for my family and the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And to a lesser extent, I was also concerned about my own friendships within the community and with Muslims generally. But I'm speaking out today because I believe that it's important for us, questioning Muslims and bona fide ex-Muslims like myself, to know that it's okay to reject beliefs that we no longer hold to be true. Whether you've been raised an Ahmadi, a Sunni, a Shia, or you simply identify as just a Muslim, you deserve to know. You deserve to know that it's okay to tell our friends and our loved ones, because once we do, only then do we truly begin living authentic lives. We normalize dissent. We give others courage to also be true to themselves. It's important for questioning Ahmadis and ex-Ahmadis, especially, to know that they're not alone in holding the view that the theological claims just don't add up. Historically, most ex-Ahmadis have not spoken up about leaving the faith unless they've also converted to Orthodox Islam. Yes, sometimes that happens. This has left a vacuum for those who both question Ahmadiyyat specifically and Islam generally. I intend to help fill that gap by being an example of normalizing dissent and doing so with dignity. I also know that there are many others who are right behind me, people who will also be speaking up. Perhaps you who are watching this right now, yes, you will be among this new wave of voices. I believe that truth matters, and if people like myself don't speak up, the religious have free rein to promote their narrative unchallenged, however noble their intentions may be. You see, in some denominations of Islam, such as the one I was born into, and which only represents 1% of the Muslim population worldwide, the leadership has promoted some very positive and peaceful messaging in several areas that Orthodox Islam is rightly criticized for. I want us to put the good values that we do find in various religions on a more honest footing and divorce them from superstition, the supernatural, and the 7th century. I believe that having come into contact with Enlightenment values, Islam today is presented and practiced in far more palatable terms here in the West than it is in Muslim-majority countries. I also believe that most religious people, Muslim or otherwise, are far better than their scriptures. For example, most Muslims deplore the idea that Western powers might employ methods of torture or bizarre punishments that are unusually cruel. Many of you watching feel this way, for which I am grateful. This makes you, and most Muslims, far better than your scriptures. Why? Well, because the Qur'an, in chapter 5, verse 33, specifies that people who cause corruption in the land can in fact be crucified. Yes, crucified. You know, nailing people to the cross? Here's a quick reminder.
Slaves, low-class troublemakers, upstart rebels.
The criminal that would merit this very public kind of execution would tend to be a criminal against the state.
The Quran also states that their hands and feet can be cut off from opposite sides. Let's take a look at Quran chapter 5, verse 33. First, the translation from Sahih International. Indeed, the penalty for those who wage war against Allah and His Messenger and strive upon earth to cause corruption is none but that they be killed or crucified, or that their hands and feet be cut off from opposite sides, or that they be exiled from the land. That is for them a disgrace in this world, and for them in the hereafter is a great punishment. For any Ahmadi Muslims concerned about the translation, let's look at the translation authorized by the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Note that this shows up as chapter 5, verse 34, since Ahmadiyya Muslims count the initial invocation of Bismillah as verse 1, everywhere that it appears. The only reward of those who wage war against Allah and His Messenger and strive to create disorder in the land is that they be slain or crucified, or their hands and feet cut off on account of their enmity, or they be expelled from the land. That shall be a disgrace for them in this world, and in the hereafter they shall have a great punishment. Now, while Ahmadi Muslim translations sometimes look radically different in meaning, for this verse at least, both translations here are expressing the same core ideas. I'll save addressing the Islamic apologetic thoughts likely going off in your mind for a future video, as I have lots to cover here. Until then, just reflect on the ambiguity of corruption in the land and the nature of the punishment prescribed. Remember, the Quran is supposed to be this perfect book for all people and for all times. If you've never paid attention to such verses before, then you're probably a bit disturbed by this revelation, as you should be. Perhaps it's time that you too looked into the book that you've been taught is perfect and ask yourself, does this really make sense to me? Do I really buy into the convoluted explanations offered in the Quranic commentaries? Do I really believe this to be the pinnacle of guidance for humanity? I don't want people who question Islam and Ahmadiyyat to have to reinvent the wheel. We need to build on the knowledge of those who've come before us, and this is why I do what I do. I lost a lot of time in my youth hedging and not moving forward with my own life because I suppressed being my authentic self. I did this to please the fragile sensibilities of others around me, whose feelings and happiness I consistently placed above my own. But if we, you and I, normalize religious dissent, then our Muslim families and our Muslim communities will no longer be so fragile. Hearing that more of us continue to leave the religion will be so commonplace that pretending to be Muslim for most of our lives will no longer be necessary. The more of us that speak up, the less hesitation we'll all have about our loved ones being shocked with the news. Apostasy from Islam is already on the rise. By bringing this reality to the surface, it is my firm belief that our friends and our families will no longer have to be traumatized by it. For my religiously inclined Muslim friends, creating an environment of live and let live with ex-Muslims would help Islam project confidence and a spirit of tolerance. It would even help to generate better apologetics for Islam. We should all embrace this openness and acceptance, especially if we're confident in our positions. Personally, I believe that apostasy from Islam is going to be the new normal. One day, it will no longer break up families. One day, it will no longer give grandmothers anxiety attacks. This process of awakening and of normalizing dissent is already underway. And I'm going to do my part so that all of us can live more authentic lives. But first, I'd like to step up and take ownership of the alias that I've been using for a few years now to talk about some of these problematic ideas within Islam generally and within Ahmadiyyat specifically. In 2016, I began blogging about religion and philosophy under an alias. My focus was Islam, often with Ahmadiyyat as the lens through which I would approach it. I wanted to put some of my thoughts out there before I revealed my identity. Using this alias, I could avoid what are now sure to be very repetitive requests for interventions. I get that many religious Muslims, especially those from the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, will want to talk to me about my beliefs and what I found so objectionable about Islam. While I still have so much more to say, and which I will say, I have now laid enough groundwork for me to finally take ownership here of the alias which I have been using. So, without further ado, my name is Sohail, and I am the man behind the alias Reason on Faith. If you want to understand my views, then read the material that I've created over the past couple of years, including 3 new long-form articles just released to coincide with this video: The Postulates, The Things We Think, and Lessons Learned on Community and Dissent. If you want to challenge me, then engage with my ideas, which you'll find on my formal blog, reasononfaith.org, as well as the shorter and more informal posts on the microblog, reasononfaith.org/microblog. Know that while I critique Islam, I detest anti-Muslim bigotry. Most of the people that I love in this world are Muslims. But even if they weren't my loved ones, standing up for the rights and the dignity of all people is the right thing to do. I will stand up in solidarity for the civil liberties of all Muslims. Will you do the same for ex-Muslims? Many of you outside of Muslim-majority countries will answer in the affirmative. And for those of you that do, I thank you. Please remember that at present, ex-Muslim atheists and other religious minorities, some Muslim minorities, in Muslim-majority countries are in harm's way. They fear for their safety and for their families. They fear their own governments and the mob justice meted out in the fundamentalist Islamic societies in which they live. We cannot convince others of the value of our ideas while they feel threatened. That is why it is incumbent upon us to protect the civil liberties of all human beings, regardless of race, religion, gender, or sexual orientation. We can be critical of ideas and still love the people that hold them. That love for humanity shouldn't stop us from challenging poor ideas. Rather, our love for humanity makes these critiques all the more pressing. As Muslim reformer Majid Nawaz so eloquently stated, no idea is above scrutiny, and no people are beneath dignity. Often, those of us critiquing religion are immediately slammed as bigots or racists. It's an all too convenient way to shut down a real dialogue about the ideas that matter. Know that if you're listening in for material to demonize Muslims or to paint Islam as all bad, then you've come to the wrong place. Depending on which source material from Islam that you follow, and depending on which tradition one uses to approach and to interpret the Qur'an, there exist several vastly different lived experiences and expressions of what Islam is. Many of us use the word Islam on its own for brevity, and that's understandable. However, it's also important that at least every so often we be specific about which interpretations we're talking about if there's at all a possibility for confusion, just to make sure that we're not talking past one another. Even amongst themselves, Muslims often cannot agree on some of the key aspects of early Islamic history, or even on the details regarding Muhammad's own life. Perhaps the closest definition for what Islam is the adage that Islam is the Qur'an. After all, everything else triggers disputes and cherry-picking amongst Muslims from different denominations. Personally, I do admire parts of Islam, or perhaps more accurately, what Islamic civilizations have helped to popularize. I appreciate that it has influenced and encouraged certain practices that have become common within Muslim-majority communities. Granted, many of these positive aspects of Islam can be found in other religions and other cultural traditions that predate Islam. Personally, I do like the way Muslims that I know gather around and support those families who've just lost a loved one. Members of the local congregation come over to offer condolences and just take over. This way, the grieving family feels supported. Or there's the emphasis on caring for and respecting our elderly, on charity, on the value of discipline and contentment with the simpler pleasures in life. There's an almost stoic acceptance of one's present condition in order to achieve happiness. Islam also places a strong emphasis on personal hygiene. And hey, that's a really good thing. Now, it is also true, sadly, that for some ex-Muslims, life has been difficult and dangerous, and sometimes even that's an understatement. Consider those ex-Muslims hailing from rigidly hardline societies in Muslim-majority countries. Their oppression and suffered abuse in the name of Islam has far eclipsed the positive experiences that others of us have been fortunate enough to have had. Of course, neither narrative represents the whole story. Remember, #NotAll. There is, in fact, no single definitive ex-Muslim experience, just as there is no single monolithic or true Islam. But it would be wrong to deny that there are some very common patterns of shunning, forced homelessness, forced marriages, cutting off funding for education, abuse, harassment, physical violence, and yes, even death threats against those who would choose to leave Islam. These harsh reactions can come from one's own family as well as from the wider Muslim community. These horror stories are not exclusive to Muslim-majority countries either. There are many, many heartbreaking stories from right here in the West when Muslims leave Islam. It is for solidarity with others who are suffering that ex-Muslims, such as myself, use the label ex-Muslim. It's not an all-encompassing label. It's not about who we are, but rather from where we've come. It's about empowering others who no longer believe to know that they too can choose. For more on the need for the ex-Muslim label, see My Beliefs, a Treatise. There, I have a section dedicated to the need for the ex-Muslim label. I know that there will be some Ahmadi Muslims watching this who are thinking to themselves, why are you attacking us? We are peaceful Muslims, and our Islam is so much better. Now, to those of you thinking these thoughts, I'll just reiterate that I am not attacking you, and I am not attacking Muslims. I am critiquing the truth claims and the moral teachings of Islam. And yes, that includes at times the Ahmadiyya interpretation of both scripture and history. I am also not attacking the many wonderful and positive things that Ahmadi Muslims do. I am sharing, however, information you should consider if following a theology grounded in actual truth is something that is important to you. I recognize that for many of you, being Muslim is just about going with the flow. It's simply about going along with whatever you were born into. That may be fine for you, but from childhood, I was taught that truth mattered. And now I'm making good on that moral training which I received in my formative years as a young Muslim. In 2017, I wrote an essay with 25 reasons for why many Muslims haven't left Islam yet. If you take a look at reason 15, the ecosystem halo effect, you'll see why many people have stayed with Islam for so long, even though deep down, most of us have had problems with it. The reason is that many modern Muslim communities in the West de-emphasize the problematic aspects of Islam. For them, the controversial minutiae intrinsic to the religion and its history is merely a backdrop to the repackaged theology which they emphasize, and which is what actually informs their day-to-day lives. The cultural and communal benefits of being a member of the Muslim community often outweigh any inclination to engage in critical thought regarding the truth claims and the history of Islam. I suspect that many Muslims mistakenly harbor the belief that if someone leaves Islam, it must have been because such a person preferred chaos over order, meaninglessness over purpose, or sin over virtue. Perhaps these caricatures are even what went through your mind when you first heard the term ex-Muslim. But may I humbly suggest to you that this is just your indoctrination at work. Such gut reactions to the concept of ex-Muslims are likely due to the countless sermons that you've been fed to dismiss those who reject Islam. Many of us ex-Muslims value the same things that you do. We value building healthy, prosperous, and ethical societies. We value truth and honesty. We want our children to grow up happy, healthy, and safe. We want them to have educational opportunities that unlock their full potential. We want them to have fulfilling lives and families of their own. I know many Muslims, including Ahmadis, who stay only because there's a structure and a system set up that they're already plugged into. It's simply momentum, convenience, and comfort. Many born Muslims also don't want to rock the boat with their parents or with their extended families and friends. There's an existential dread that can come from leaving religion. And yet, at the same time, there's also something deeply inspiring about not living a lie. There's something spiritually fulfilling in noticing and acting upon the realization that we have the chance to improve the fate of humankind in the here and now. As human beings, we crave identity, community, and purpose. In fact, we need these things to truly thrive. Most religions give us all three ready-made and neatly packaged. That does not mean, however, that these religions are all true. It just means that they're useful, at least in this regard. What I am advocating for, however, is not that we abandon these very human needs, but rather that we rebuild the foundations to better serve them. I propose that we remove the supernatural religious foundations in favor of more honest ones. The best that our legacy of philosophical thought the world over has to offer. I do think that on the whole, post-Enlightenment religious communities that promote secularism and pluralism do actually provide a lot of value to their members, despite their flaws and the holes in their theology. I believe that we needn't dismantle these community relationships as we challenge their foundational theology. We may begin the transition to more honest foundations by simply acknowledging and accepting that the underlying substrate is suspect and that the Qur'an is a human text. Eventually, these congregations, like those of some churches, will transform in place into humanist congregations. To those of you Muslims who are questioning, or who in secret no longer believe, I want you to know that there are so many of us who have been pretending to believe, and for far too long. Many of us have been and still are office bearers in senior positions within the mosque and within the Islamic councils of our respective communities. But it's important now that we speak up. For when we do, we find one another. We connect and we form networks of our own. Today, in this age, we have the tools, we have the means, and yes, we have the technology. When we do speak out, we even force the more orthodox elements of the community to acknowledge our existence. No longer is it a one-way conversation that starts and ends with, "Because I said so," or "This is what Allah wants. You cannot question it further." In reality, there is honesty and there is nobility in being vocal and in being authentic. It's high time that we discard outdated theology. It's time to be honest about the foundations of this religion, even though some versions of the faith have attempted to paint a sugar-coated veneer over the history of Islam, over its scriptures, its thought, and its religious figures. Now, I do have a message for those Muslims who wish to fight these ideas with more than just ideas. To them, to those of you who believe that violence and threats are the way to respond to ex-Muslims, I have this to say. If you're about to threaten or disown a family member for exercising their human right to religious self-determination, or because they're dating or marrying a non-Muslim, then you should think again. In the age of global media, your religious intolerance and shunning is likely going to become public, as ex-Muslims share their lives with one another in support networks. You see, we're becoming connected, and we are empowering ourselves. We're now speaking up in the West. Once you disown or coerce someone with threats, and they feel like they've got nothing left to lose, they will speak out. They will speak openly about how the reality of living in some Muslim families doesn't always match up with the friendly face of Islam promoted by Muslims in the West. If you're a Muslim who cares about the reputation of Islam, then know that the coercive behavior of some Muslims can promote a disgust of the very thing you and they are likely trying to uphold. Just as your religious cohorts once did, and some still do, in their issuing of self-righteous excommunication announcements at the mosque, the brazen threats and trickery of religious families who take it that far are ultimately going to backfire. It won't make Islam look more tolerant, and it will definitely push would-be converts away. Consider the case of young Mahad, an American student of Somali heritage whose mother tried to trick him into gay conversion therapy in Kenya. She lured him back to Africa under the guise of visiting his extended family. Once Mahad had arrived, his mother informed him that he would not be continuing his university studies in America. In fact, he wouldn't even be going back to America. Instead, he'd be undergoing intense religious indoctrination in a dodgy gay conversion therapy camp. But with the help of other freethinkers across 2 continents, springing into action in real time, Mahad managed to escape and make it safely back to the USA. His story was even covered by the BBC World News. Needless to say, Mahad's own mother is now quite embarrassed. She feels humiliated, even within her own Somali-American Muslim community, and far more than she would ever have been had she simply accepted her gay ex-Muslim son right from the start. Mahad's mother had the choice to love him unconditionally, even if she didn't like and didn't approve of his beliefs, which is absolutely her prerogative. But her own religious indoctrination had blinded her from seeing, even as a possibility, this option for unconditional love. 2 years on, she now wants a relationship with her son again. But understandably, he cannot trust her enough to even step foot in her home. Mahad's trust was violated, and this by his own mother. The relationship is irrevocably damaged. Don't let that happen to you. Don't let that happen to your family. If you disown a family member, trick them, punish them, or coerce them with violence in the name of religion, your story will be told. If honor is what you're concerned with, know that coercive behaviors will ultimately bring an even greater dishonor to you and your family. With the rise of social media, the ramifications may no longer be limited to just the people that you know at the mosque. Do you really want your neighbors and colleagues to know that you've kicked out and disowned your own flesh and blood simply because they chose to reject the religion which claims that there's no compulsion in religion? What good is no compulsion if you replace it with a heavy-handed dose of coercion and manipulation? So instead, I humbly suggest that you preempt all of this. Learn to accept that the world is changing and that your family members still love you. You can still be a big part of their lives, but only if you're willing to love and accept them as they are, without religious preconditions. Love and support them, even if they make choices that don't fit into your ideal prescriptions for living. Don't just say the words, live them. For you, your religion, and for me, mine. Now, some of you may be wondering, where do these harsh attitudes come from? Well, it certainly cannot be reduced to a mere cultural problem. This phenomena exists across many vastly different cultures and ethnicities who identify as Islamic. Many of you will be familiar with the hadith, the saying of Prophet Muhammad, "None of you will have faith till he loves me more than his father, his children, and all mankind." Now, while I've just read you the variant of this famous hadith from Sahih Bukhari, you can also find a variation of this same hadith in the compilation known as Sahih Muslim. What's interesting here is how the chapter preamble in this particular compilation happens to make it crystal clear, if it wasn't already, that a Muslim's love for Muhammad must trump their love for everyone else. The obligation to love the Messenger of Allah more than one's family, son, father, and all other people, and mentions of an absolute absence of faith regarding one who does not love him with such love. In commenting on this hadith, Twitter user The Masked Arab asks us, "Is it really love when you have no other option?" I believe that pronouncements such as this one are dangerous, say nothing of them being unnatural. Such hadith place religious affiliations and religious goals over and above the acceptance and love that nature has endowed in all of us, towards our children, siblings, and parents. It's time to reject this hadith and all of the cultural baggage that goes with it. Religious communities are famous for naming and shaming people who fall out of line. But we shouldn't name and shame the ones we love for exercising their personal religious beliefs within the sphere of their own lives. When religion can be a personal matter that doesn't place religious expectations on others, we can all live in harmony. It's called live and let live. Former believers will, however, share their heartfelt stories of rejection, ostracization, and worse. Sharing experiences helps to build awareness that in the name of religion, in the name of Islam, such destructive behaviors do still persist. This isn't something that just happens in Sudan or Iran or Saudi Arabia. We're talking about places like America, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. And with families, many of whom have been here for over 20 years. So we have to raise awareness. Sometimes sunlight is the best disinfectant. I don't want, however, to appeal to your sensibilities for acceptance with a stick. I'd much rather appeal to your sense of love and compassion because all of you, yes, all of you, have this. I'm asking you now to draw upon it whenever you encounter these circumstances. If you love your Muslim community, if you look to your Islamic faith for inspiration and direction, if your heart swells when you hear of a new convert joining the fold, then I want you to go back to those very thoughts if ever you've been tempted to lash out or cut off a family member for exercising their freedom of belief. When it comes to family, unconditional love matters. If you want converts to Islam to benefit from that love, then you have to model it in your own lives, in your own families, and in your own Islamic communities. Imagine if a woman from a Christian family became a Muslim, joining your particular denomination of Islam. Imagine, too, that her family rejected her. They disowned her. They cut off her funding to complete her undergraduate studies. Imagine if they forbid her from even talking to the Muslim friends of hers who had first introduced her to Islam. Wouldn't you wish her burden was eased? Wouldn't you wish that her devout Christian parents showed unconditional love and acceptance despite their differences? Wouldn't it be nice if they lovingly agreed to disagree on theological matters, but still embrace their daughter with unconditional love? If you can appreciate how much better it would have been for a convert's family to continue to love their adult child, why do some in our own Muslim communities behave so badly with their own flesh and blood? Freedom of conscience truly exists when all of us, regardless of beliefs, can place unconditional love over and above religious disagreements. Love your children more than the prophet you were taught to revere. Your children are not your intellectual property to control. As they emerge into adulthood, they deserve the opportunity to live authentic lives without either of you having to lose the love that you both share today. They won't follow your religion. They won't join you for prayer time. They won't go to the mosque during Ramadan, and they won't follow your dietary restrictions. They won't marry whom you choose for them, and they will need to explore philosophy, health, and relationships in their own way to find fulfillment and congruence for their own lives. To close this segment, I'd like to read for you a short excerpt from the writings of Khalil Gibran, the 20th century Lebanese author and poet who wrote the timeless classic, The Prophet. His thoughts on children are very much worthy of our reflection. And a woman who held a babe against her bosom said, "Speak to us of children." And he said, "Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you, for life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday." And this brings me to the meaning of our lives. So, what's the meaning of life for those of us who have left religion, you might ask? Well, instead of having a non-negotiable purpose handed down to us, we find it much more meaningful that we choose and we create our own purpose. We seek out and we create the life that is meaningful to us. As Dan Barker famously put it, asking, "If there is no God, what is the purpose of life?" is like asking, "If there is no master, whose slave shall I be?" Leaving religion for me was not because, as some religious people might suggest, that I must have been angry at God or hated God. Quite the contrary. In my devoutly religious youth, I never had a problem with God in the abstract, or even with the classic problem of evil from philosophy. At the time that I began to question, all I had ever had in life were amazing opportunities ahead of me, including a really prodigious standing in my own religious community. I was also high school valedictorian. I was accepted into and attended the top engineering school in the country. The national missionary in charge had even visited my dad when I was 19 and asked if I was engaged, since, given my religious activism, many families in the community who had daughters were already interested in my availability for their daughters. At religious community functions, on several occasions, people whom I didn't even know would approach me and comment on how I was the Jamaat's youngest muballigh in Canada. I had a wonderful childhood, and my parents were always loving. They have always given everything of themselves for us, their children. Mine was always a happy home. There's no doubt about it. I have been blessed. But my own religious study of Islam stressed upon me that many people in the past had died for what they believed to be true, and that standing up for what is true, no matter how unpopular, how inconvenient, or how much it may negatively impact our own lives, was the higher moral virtue. This is why I ultimately reconciled with having chosen this much harder path. I did lose many opportunities in life as a result of choosing to follow my deepest convictions about what is true. It would have been much easier, much more advantageous socially, and much more opportunistic of me had I simply pretended to be a true believer, or even just a nominal Muslim. I want to help create a world where choosing the more honest path doesn't come with such a high social cost, with such a high price. Now, with respect to God, I have a metaphysical and philosophical take that allows for creative forces beyond space, time, and our reality to have informed our notions of time and existence. This is why I use the label agnostic deist. It's the religions of man that I have a problem with. It's the religions of man that we have before us all that all fall short of what would indeed be, if it exists, a truly awesome power. Now, there's no functional difference between deism and atheism in how we live our lives. Hence, I promote and align with atheism insofar as this position today is where the most coherent critique of religious truth claims happens to be coming from. I also recognize that there's an innate human need for all of us to not only take care of ourselves, but to serve others. And in this realization, we begin to understand the path for how we find meaning and purpose in our own lives. It is my humble opinion that when religion is removed from society, we leave a void in some respects. We do need to have available for everyone interested some structure and some guidance on how people can construct their own meaning, especially if they've never previously exercised any creative self-determination in their own lives. This is often the case with those who've been part of a religious flock for most or all of their lives. That said, I do believe that every one of us can benefit from a best practices for living guide that's not anchored to unsubstantiated claims. Whether we were born Muslim, born Christian, or born into any other religion, including having been born without religion, some structure can help us get off the ground in finding and in articulating our own purpose. Structure in this regard can also help build character. We can value constraints in our lives to a point as liberating, such as when we acknowledge phenomena like the paradox of choice, the limited impact of willpower alone, and the inverse relationship between habits and decision fatigue. What we don't need in creating our own meaning for life, or for telling us what is good and what is moral, are any of the scriptures ascribed to the angry and vindictive Abrahamic deity. Remember, it is this same Abrahamic deity who thought that stoning people to death was moral and necessary. That deity thought that raining down fire and brimstone on homosexuals was A-OK. He even boasts about doing so in the Qur'an. When we talk about religion and life's purpose, we're never too far from the topic of morality. The question always arises, can we live moral lives without religion? In reality, when we navigate the moral landscape with the promotion of human well-being as our mantra, instead of the arbitrary dictates of a deity driving the definition of morality, also known as divine command theory, we become better equipped to make more compassionate choices which maximize human happiness and which minimize human suffering. We, for example, no longer feel compelled to punish homosexuals for living a life of fulfillment that we wouldn't even deny ourselves as heterosexual people.
You identify yourself as gay. Why do you then choose, because it is a choice, why do you then choose to be a Muslim when it says explicitly within Islam, within Judeo-Christian tradition, that that is prohibited? Why would you choose to be a Muslim? Why would you choose to be a Muslim if in the Qur'an it says that that is prohibited? Surah Al-A'raf, I can give you the ayah that it says it is okay and accepted to be gay in Islam. That is not, it's a loaded question, but I'm sorry, you either be gay or you be Muslim. No one is forcing you.
The Muslim woman in the previous clip spoke from a position of honestly engaging with Islamic scripture and centuries of Abrahamic tradition which predate and which have informed early Islam, including the norms which Muhammad had himself fostered. We don't have to like her conclusions to agree with her method of engaging with her religion's source texts. Getting Muslims to ignore or to reject an authentic reading of their scriptures is a separate matter from being honest about what the most plausible reading is of those same scriptures. In the next couple of clips, the masked Arab will take us through some of the Qur'an and Hadiths on the topic of homosexuality. The video is entitled Islam and ISIS, Killing Homosexuals, and is part of the masked Arab's 15-part series entitled Islam and ISIS. You can see the URL on the screen here, and I recommend you check out the entire 15-part series. It's very elucidating. And without further ado, I give you the masked Arab.
The Quran tells us several times that the tribe of Lot in Sodom were punished for their actions, which included men approaching other men in lust. It condemns what they did and tells us God punished them as a result by turning their whole town upside down and showering them with brimstone. The Quran condemns homosexuality in very clear terms. We also sent Lut. He said to his people, "Do ye commit lewdness such as no people in creation ever committed before you? For ye practice your lusts on men in preference to women. Ye are indeed a people transgressing beyond bounds." And his people gave no answer but this. They said, "Drive them out of your city. These are indeed men who want to be clean and pure." But we saved him and his family, except his wife. She was one of those who lagged behind. And we rained down on them a shower of brimstone. Then see what was the end of those who indulged in sin and crime. So basically, the Quran states that no people were ever homosexual before the people of Lot, and these first homosexuals were all wiped out for their crime by divine intervention. Another example, chapter 27 verse 55 reads, "What, do you indeed approach men lustfully rather than women? Nay, you are a people who act ignorantly." This hadith is from Sunan Abu Dawud, and it reads, "The Prophet said, if you find anyone doing as Lot's people did, kill the one who does it and the one to whom it is done." Now, this isn't quite classified as Sahih, or in other words, fully authentic, but instead it has the second highest classification as Hasan Sahih. So pretty reliable according to those who believe in the whole idea that the methodology for gathering any of these narrations was reliable testimony in the first place anyway.
While Ahmadi Muslims reject the hadith that gays should be plunged to their death from high places, which is what ISIS dutifully carried out, they do support an ambiguous punishment for homosexuality. That is, leaving it to the discretion of a judge. He can decide the fate of someone accused of engaging in such a relationship. There's nothing stopping such a judge in a Muslim society from choosing a very severe criminal punishment here based on existing Islamic precedent. Even the fourth Khalifa of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community laments at how homosexuality is no longer seen as a crime. these are the kinds of attitudes that your khulafa, if you're an Ahmadi Muslim, would like to take us back to. Do you want to recreate such an intolerant society? Would you like to see your gay colleague James from accounting or lesbian colleague Tanya in HR viewed as criminals? If you pay any chanda to the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat, then you are voting yes with your money to take us back to that kind of a world. So the next time you donate to the mosque, please think about the worldview that you are promoting and that you are supporting with your hard-earned cash. You might now be wondering, where do these attitudes come from? Why do Muslim leaders perpetuate such contempt? Well, because Allah in the Qur'an is said to have destroyed the people of Lot for tolerating homosexuality. Allah did this by raining down fire and brimstone upon them. As Muslims, we're apparently okay with that. Yet we grieve when 50 people are killed at the Pulse nightclub in Florida from a rain of bullets fired by a gunman who was also targeting homosexuals. As a Muslim, do you not see this disconnect here? You're not okay with the slaughter of gays when a gunman does it. That's immoral. But if God does it, it's suddenly moral, righteous, and true justice? Don't you see the problem here? Do you think that this story from the Quran encourages us to love or to at least promote benevolence and compassion toward homosexuals? If Islam in the West didn't have to tone down its rhetoric to distance itself from such intolerance, do you really think that the Islamic world would generate the Enlightenment values and attitudes that you probably cherish today? What does that say about the inherent depth and wisdom of such scriptures? Next, let's consider Muhammad's victorious return to Mecca, where the Meccans surrendered and bloodshed was avoided. That part of the story sounds great. Did Muhammad smashing the idols in the Kaaba on his victorious return to Mecca actually promote religious tolerance and pluralism? Is this the perfect model for mankind that you wish to share with the world? Why not have these idols carefully removed from the Kaaba and then just placed outside for anyone who still revered them to come and collect them? To argue that Islam advocates for secularism and pluralism when we have this distasteful example from Muhammad's own life is to be in utter denial. Now, if you'd like to explore this particular topic further, see my blog post, Muhammad Smashes the Idols and the Freedom of Religion along with it. It's now time to talk about stoning. And when we say stoning, we really mean stoning to death. There is no halfway point here advocated by the Abrahamic faiths of merely stoning to a bloody pulp, but not quite killing. Most of you, I would hope, would find stoning to death to be a brutal, cruel, and immoral punishment, and yet the God of the Old Testament was fine with it. It was, after all, his idea. As Muslims, you too are raised to believe that Allah, at one time, did find stoning people to death acceptable. But you'll happily criticize ISIS as un-Islamic when they stone people, since that doesn't fit your narrative of what Islam should be or what can ever be justified by a God. Does that sound right? Please do think about this and whether you're being consistent. And before any of you Ahmadi Muslims especially chime in with the retort that the Quran only advocates for lashes in cases of fornication and adultery and doesn't condone stoning, please remember that from your own Ahmadi Muslim theology, you implicitly accept that Muhammad followed the Mosaic law of stoning people to death before the Quranic verse on lashings was revealed. So it's not in the Quran, but it is something that your prophet carried out. Those of us who are born Muslims have to own that fact in assessing his moral character. Of course, you can be an Ahmadi Muslim who believes that stoning to death was never right and just reject that part of your religion. But in doing so, you're rejecting the prophethood of Muhammad by the very act of disagreeing with something he did. You're also demonstrating that you have a greater sense of morality than Allah, whom you've been taught to worship. This is a good thing. Hold on to that inner moral compass, and welcome to the journey of questioning and of thinking for yourself. Some of you, however, will still be in denial about Ahmadiyya Islam supporting the view that Prophet Muhammad had actually stoned people to death. But it's not just Orthodox Muslims who believe this from Islam's earliest source material. So let's take a look at some Ahmadi Muslim literature together. I'm going to show you that Ahmadiyyat, in no uncertain terms, admits that Prophet Muhammad had people stoned to death. First, we'll go to the official website of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat and look for an article by Sir Chaudhry Muhammad Zufrullah Khan. It's called Islamic Concept of the State. If we scroll down to near the very end, we come across this paragraph. Other offenses specifically mentioned in the Holy Quran are adultery, 24:3, calumniation of chaste women, 24:5, and theft, 539. The penalty of adultery is 100 stripes, and of calumniation, 80 stripes. Till these penalties were prescribed by the Quran, the Holy Prophet followed the Torah and imposed the penalty of death by stoning in the case of adultery. Next, we'll return to the Jamaat's website and we'll look at what their esteemed Quranic commentaries have to say. We'll select the 5-volume commentary and then jump to page 1837. This is where we'll find the commentary for Quran chapter 24, verse 3, using the Ahmadiyya numbering scheme. Allow me to read an excerpt for you, which tries to explain away why some Orthodox Muslims believe that stoning is part of the Prophet's Sunnah and thus still part of Islam. The misconception seems to be due to a few cases recorded in the Hadith when married persons guilty of adultery were stoned to death by the order of the Holy Prophet. One of these few cases was that of a Jew and a Jewess who were stoned to death in accordance with the Mosaic law. Bukhari. It was invariably the Holy Prophet's practice that he abided by the law of the Torah in deciding cases till a new commandment was revealed to him. In one or two other cases on record, in which the punishment accorded was stoning to death, it has not been established whether the crime was committed before or after the verse under comment was revealed. And there you have it. What I've just shown you seals the deal. It confirms that at least in this regard, the Old Testament and Muhammad's time was considered to be a trustworthy representation of God's instructions to the Jews, and that Prophet Muhammad had people stoned to death in following God's orders. That God, presumably your God, condoned stoning people to death for adultery. Sadly, he didn't suggest marital counseling from a wise elder in the community, or even rehabilitation. No, just stoning to death. So much for the adage that the punishment should fit the crime. So much for Allah demonstrating a higher morality for us human beings. Now, if you've never watched someone being stoned to death, or if you need to be reminded of what it looks like, then please see the videos that I've linked to in the description box. Now, some Muslims, including Ahmadi Muslim missionaries, will try to justify stoning by saying that it was important for God to create a deterrent by being disproportionately brutal as a means of preempting a greater evil. If the punishment was indeed necessary to curb such behavior, what guarantee do we have that human civilization won't devolve into such reckless hedonism again, as perceived by these same apologists for Islam? Put your believer cap on and consider this scenario. If the Quran now limits the punishment to lashings, what are we as a society to do if adultery becomes so out of hand one day that we really do need stoning to death to teach people a lesson and send a warning to others? What was unique about the time of Moses that has irrevocably changed in human nature for all times since? In conversation with an Ahmadi Muslim missionary on Twitter, I discussed this very topic of why God would even allow stoning people to death in the first place. Missionary Farhan Iqbal Sahib responded with questions of his own. But I also have this question for academic purposes. Why do you consider it excessive? What is the moral ground for you to object to it? Utilitarianism? Reason? I responded that stoning people to death is obviously gruesome, and that when we look at violations of the prevailing social contract, namely fornication and adultery, the punishment does not fit the crime. The missionary's response relayed that he believed stoning adulterers to death was to prevent the spread of immorality and promiscuity in ancient societies, and that such a harsh punishment saved entire generations from harm. It's time for you to ask yourself, do you really believe this? Take a look at the footage of how people are stoned to death, and then ask yourself once again. Seriously, pause this video if you need to, and watch a video of someone actually getting stoned to death. Where is the verse in the Torah, or even in the Quran, where God suggests that people get some counseling first, or where God suggests that people part ways first in an orderly fashion before they're tempted to commit adultery, if they really wished to be with someone else? If we can regard a vastly disproportionate punishment as just on the basis that it would prevent a greater evil, would these same Muslim leaders, like the Khulafa of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, approve of Western powers employing various methods of brutal torture leading up to an execution? Would that be justified to them and to you so as to provide a deterrence against a greater evil? What about cluster bombing communities with a high concentration of hardline terrorist sympathizers as a preemptive measure to avoid a greater evil? Some of you will have made the astute observation that many Western powers are not exempt from having committed such atrocities, from incurring such a heavy toll of civilian casualties in their pursuit of actual criminals, terrorists, or as a deterrence in military conflicts. It would be quite reasonable of you to reject these strategies and the excuses often made for them, whether by the East or by the West. So why do you accept these same excuses with how the God of Islam doled out his punishments in the past? Why does he get a pass for enabling and commanding such horrendous cruelty? Think about the many human rights activists who often march with Muslims and campaign against torture. Consider also that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights explicitly condemns torture. Now go look for a statement in the Quran that explicitly condemns torture, be it for the extraction of information or as part of a legitimate punishment meted out to other human beings. Tell me when you find such instruction in a verse of the Qur'an. Remember, mental gymnastics and Quranic commentaries don't count. Spin is not scripture. Here's a short Twitter conversation with an Ahmadi Muslim. Pause the video if you'd like to read it in full. Most Muslim apologists want to condemn torture, but they'll gladly and narrowly define torture as pain and cruelty inflicted solely for the extraction of information. That, in their eyes, is morally reprehensible. But they have no leg to stand on when we point out that the Quran spells out and allows for the use of punishments like crucifixion. The crux of humanity's justified revulsion to torture does not revolve around whether information extraction is or is not part of the equation. It's the drawn-out process of agonizing pain to which we object. By Islamic apologist logic, cruel and unusual punishment is only wrong if you're also trying to extract information from someone, but it's otherwise morally justified if you're simply administering punishment for a crime. So it's not okay to crucify a criminal to extract information, but it is okay to crucify them as a straight-up punishment for a crime? To be fair, our Ahmadi Muslim interlocutor here, condemning torture in the pursuit of extracting information, at the time of this recording, hadn't responded to my last tweet about information extraction not being the aspect of torture that most of us find repulsive. But even as intelligent and as witty as many Islamic apologists can be, what justifications can one possibly bring to bear on this selective outrage? Further, one should note that Article 1 of the United Nations Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, in classifying torture, does not limit its definition exclusively to the pursuit of information. The UN includes in their definition of torture any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted. By this benchmark, the punishment of crucifixion, as given by Allah in Quran 533, violates the UN Convention Against Torture. People often die from crucifixion after days, not hours. Just think about how ridiculous one's apologetics have to be to spin this. Now, if you think that all will be made up for in the next life, and that therefore it's okay for God to take human lives and command such disproportionate punishments, then you've just admitted that in Islam, human life can be and is devalued in comparison to the view that this life on earth is the only life that we know that we have. In Islam, and indeed in many religions, God can just make up for it later. He can be vicious now, and we'll give him a pass. This is how religion can give people an excuse with which to devalue human life. This is the same logic employed by the Taliban terrorists who shot up school children in Peshawar, Pakistan in 2014. The lives of innocent human children were expendable in their eyes. In the minds of these Taliban terrorists, the children were getting an express pass to heaven, to a better life in the hereafter. At its foundation, it's the same twisted logic that devalues our human lives on earth. Now, returning to stoning for fornication or adultery, ask yourself, why was this punishment only needed for a small segment of the world's civilizations? Why was it needed for just the people living in Israel, Palestine, Arabia, and surrounding regions. Were the inhabitants of the Middle East the only people who fell prey to adultery on such a massive scale that only by stoning people could their societies be saved from devolving into chaos? Consider ancient societies in China. Did they ever use stoning to death for adultery to protect their civilization from a greater evil? As a deterrent? Did ancient Australians? What about indigenous peoples of the Canadian tundra? To be sure, adultery is vile. It breaks a trust. It can ruin families. But death? Do you really think that these people deserved to die? May I suggest to you that these explanations from Muslim apologists are all post hoc rationalizations to excuse the inexcusable. To be clear, I don't believe these disproportionate, life-ending punishments are morally justified under the excuse that they are simply deterrents against greater evils. And so I humbly submit to you, please reflect. Don't make any more excuses for the religion. Don't make any more excuses for Islam. You're better than that. This Leaving Islam video was but the first part in a series of videos called Coming Out. In this series, I'll further introduce myself and my activism as Reason on Faith. In subsequent videos, I'm going to tell you a bit more about my background, and in the very next video, in fact, I'll share details about my devoutly religious past as an Ahmadi Muslim. Now, while I've just touched upon 3 problematic issues in Islamic theology and history, I'm now going to give you 3 more. The next 3 issues to consider are covered in full in My Beliefs, a Treatise. This is a relevant read if you're keen to know more about my current beliefs in general. It's also a great place to go if you would like even more arguments for why I believe that Islam is neither true nor a source of guidance, let alone the pinnacle of moral guidance. Specifically, the section of my treatise entitled Exegeses, When It Can Mean Anything, It Means Nothing. There, I cover 3 issues as an example in flawed scripture. These issues get a much more detailed treatment in writing, of course, but I'm going to preview them for you here, now. So here's what's coming up. First, the Ant-Men of chapter 27 of the Qur'an. Second, Miraculous Metaphor, Jesus in the Qur'an. Third, the permission to beat one's wife in Qur'an 434. The Ant-Men of chapter 27 of the Qur'an. This topic is presented using the Ahmadi Muslim interpretation where the Arabic word namal, meaning ant, is supposedly referring to a tribe of humans that have taken on the name ant as their animal symbol, sort of like a sports team today might call themselves the Bulldogs or the Stallions. Ahmadi Muslims maintain that namal here isn't actually referring to literal ants. The Quranic verse in question, however, talks about these same ants getting trampled upon accidentally, with human soldiers not realizing that they might actually crush these ants. Such passages hardly make any sense if we treat the ant reference as if it's referring to human beings. But contrast this with the Orthodox Muslim view, which takes these simple words at face value, and it will strike you as the more honest reading of what's written in the Quran, even if it does sound like a children's fable. Remember, the religious people of the 7th century and prior totally bought into such stories as literally true. The Jews rejected Jesus in part because they expected Elijah first to return on a literal chariot of fire. In the case of this Quranic verse, Solomon understands and is pleased with the speech of ants, literal ants. This, of course, would represent a supernatural miracle and not merely some elaborate metaphor. Both interpretations, the Ahmadi and the Orthodox, are of course really problematic, each for their own reasons. Seeing the folly of another interpretation. Human beings often find it easy to see the folly of others because we are often not accustomed to the viewpoints of others. For this very same reason, we human beings also find it harder to see the folly in our own traditions. Sometimes we're presented with false dichotomies where neither position is actually true. It is possible for both to be wrong. The easy confidence with which I know another man's religion is folly teaches me to suspect that my own is also. Mark Twain. The second issue from my treatise is Miraculous Metaphor, Jesus in the Qur'an. While Orthodox Muslims take the miracle descriptions at face value, Ahmadi Muslims treat all of these Jesus miracles in the Qur'an as metaphor. In my treatise, I unpack the Ahmadi Muslim position and I argue that it is untenable. The deity who would write such things, time after time, in successive scriptures, given the context of human beings repeatedly mistaking metaphor for the real deal, well, that deity cannot be called a just God. Such a deity can only be described one way. He's trolling us. He's an author who is purposely misdirecting human beings. Consider the adage from human user interface design and technology. Bad design is not user error. Here's another example. Misunderstanding a poorly structured syllabus and an ambiguously written lesson guide is also not the fault of the student. Of course, if you take the Orthodox Muslim position of Jesus having literally raised the dead to life and having literally given sight to the physically blind, then while you absolve God of trolling, you now have a host of other issues to contend with, such as why God seemed to do all of his best work in an age where we couldn't properly document such things. Why is it that God has now decided to go into retirement in the age of video cameras and scientific methods of inquiry? Finally, the third issue from my treatise covers the permission to beat one's wife granted in Quran chapter 4, verse 34. In my treatise, I also make reference to commentary from Ahmadi Muslim sources. If you've ever wondered why a husband in Islam is given the right to beat his wife if he fears her disobedience, well then, you owe it to yourself to read my exploration of this very topic. In fact, I have a small exercise for you. At the end of this topic, I pose 3 questions of my own for all Muslims to consider. My questions are for those of you who believe that the Quran is meant for all time and that it represents the pinnacle of moral guidance for humanity. Without dodging the subject, answer my 3 questions at the end of this wife-beating topic. If not to me, then as you ponder these 3 questions, at least be honest with yourself. In fact, let's try it together right now. What if Quran 434 did not allow a man to beat his wife? In such a scenario, would you then, 1, criticize the Quran for being incomplete? 2, claim that the Quran was missing needed prescriptions for harmonious and healthy marital relations among some elements of society where men feared disobedience from their wives? Or 3, claim that the Quran lacked the moral high ground since it did not have this provision to beat one's disobedient wife? I think the answer to all of these is clear. Of course not. Therefore, you have just proven to yourself that we human beings can do better. So if not to me, at least admit it to yourself. The 3 topics from my treatise that I've just given you a glimpse of, well, these are just the tip of the iceberg. My coverage, in brief, certainly doesn't do these topics justice, so I strongly encourage those of you who doubt the veracity of these contentions to read the full treatment of each of these 3 issues in my treatise. I've encountered many more problematic issues with Islam. Female POWs and sexual slavery with the whole what your right hands possess. Female inheritance and witness ratios in the Quran that at best only made sense for 7th century Arabia, but not for all peoples and all times going forward in God's final message. This list just goes on, and I want my fellow Muslim brethren, those of you who care about what is true and what is moral, to explore these topics with me. You owe it to yourself and to future generations to evaluate the truth claims of Islam, all the while accounting for the inherent bias given your own childhood indoctrination. It's a big topic that's affected most of us hailing from a religious upbringing. In this next clip, YouTuber Treatise takes us through why this phenomena is so problematic when the goal is truth and authenticity. This particular excerpt was taken from one of Treatise's best videos. It's called Grooming Minds. I'm only going to share a short segment with you here, but I highly recommend that you watch Grooming Minds in full. It's thought-provoking, as is the rest of his video catalog. If there's one YouTuber on philosophy, religion, and psychology that you shouldn't miss, it's Treatise.
Some apologists claim indoctrinated children remain free to think. Some of them reject the power of indoctrination altogether, suggesting children will grow up to believe whatever they want anyway. How disingenuous can you get? Indoctrinators know full well that if they succeed in dominating the child's mind in the first few years, there's every chance the beliefs they implant will stick. It's spelled out in the familiar vow attributed to both Aristotle and Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier. Give me a child until he is 7, and I will show you the man. This statement shows a clear understanding that these first few years offer an opportunity like no other. In these early years, children are developing their conceptual models of how the world works. If ideas are injected at this stage, they'll stand a great chance of becoming an essential part of how the individual views reality. Injecting ideas in a child's mind is child's play. All kinds of outlandish stories can be presented as facts by adults, and they'll be believed, with the total trust typical of infancy. Freedom to think requires the ability to think, to appraise what you're told. Very young children are incapable of this. Evidence that they're later becoming capable comes when they start asking awkward questions, showing they're not merely swallowing what they're being handed, but beginning to process the material critically. But as I've already noted, indoctrination demands uncritical acceptance. These questions are not welcomed, and indoctrinators use a range of power-based manipulations and punitive measures to silence them, including warnings about blasphemy. These induce guilt and anxiety in the child, and very effectively stop thought. So much for being free to think. Having groomed the child's mind to accept the religious ideology, the indoctrinator can now exploit a well-documented human quirk, the desire for consistency.
In this coming out video series, of which this has been just the very first video, I will also share with you my book of religious questions on problematic verses found within the Qur'an. Verses which institutionalize women's inequality, despite how the Islamic apologists will try to spin it. My book was privately released to the most senior leadership of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in Canada, and it has gone unanswered for 21 years. I named the book The Things We Think But Are Too Afraid to Say. That book is now public for the very first time, and you can download it today from inside the post called The Things We Think, which is also found at reasononfaith.org. Have you ever heard an Ahmadi Muslim Khalifa, missionary, or Jamaat president encouraging you to question your inherited beliefs by studying material critical of Islam directly, instead of through curated refutations produced by the Jamaat? Have you ever heard them suggest that for every Jamaat missionary that you consult with your question, you should also dedicate equal time to a knowledgeable and charismatic Christian pastor, atheist philosopher, and a previously devout Muslim who's now left the faith? When have such leaders admonished you not to socially boycott family members who choose to leave the religion or who choose to not live religious lives? So as not to encourage the creation of hypocrites who feel stuck between disbelief in private and fake professions of faith on the surface? Where is this push for authenticity in the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat? Where do you see this in Muslim mosques generally, whether in the West or in the heart of the Islamic world? It's clear to me that promoting authenticity and critical thinking without the implicit threat of losing your standing, reputation, and the respect of others you care about is not something religious movements are interested in. No matter how much the Quran obsesses over the hypocrites, Islamic totalitarianism creates the very situation that breeds hypocrisy, as people feel trapped, socially and emotionally blackmailed, sometimes financially held hostage as well. I say that it's time that we all call bullshit on this culture of intimidation. Be that proud little boy in the parade who called out the emperor for having no clothes. Deep down, you know it's a myth. And so with that food for thought, you may be wondering, where to from here? Don't worry, we've got you covered. Many brave ex-Muslims who've come well before me have laid the groundwork for new communities. Some have been writing books, speaking at conferences, or forging new platforms with new media, blogs, podcasts, videos, and interview shows. Having unique life experiences, there is a diversity of opinion and approach to our activism, certainly. No one activist is in lockstep with any other. But we are all united in wanting to create a better world for apostates from Islam. There are so many activists from around the globe, many who are trailblazers, in fact, too numerous to list off here. And one day, you too may be among them. In future videos, I'll tell you more about my current activism and why you might also wish to join one of the ex-Muslim support communities popping up. They are, in fact, springing up all over the world. But here's a quick backgrounder. In 2015, I myself joined the Ex-Muslims of North America, EXMNA, and it was a shot in the arm for me. It's what gave me the impetus and the strength to begin my activism as Reason on Faith. And so, a shout out to my brothers and sisters at the Ex-Muslims of North America, who are doing an amazing job of rapidly growing in-person meetups and real communities all over the continent. Now, if you're a questioning Muslim who's not yet ready to give up Islam, well, don't despair. There's a community for you as well. It's called Muslimish, and they too have chapters opening up all over North America with in-person meetups that help foster dialogue and provide support, all without the awkward judgment most of you will have encountered in your mosque circles. If you'd like to join Muslimish, some things to note. The meetups and memberships are available in North America only at present. If you're a Muslim who wants to join, it's because you've already acknowledged that Islam itself is flawed and imperfect. You would have already passed the stage of making excuses for Islam on doctrinal issues. It is not a place for proselytizing and probing Muslims to join to do dawah to questioning Muslims and ex-Muslims. Now, while it is a group for both ex-Muslims and questioning Muslims, it's not for the faint of heart or those who are easily offended. You should be ready to read, hear, and see blasphemous content as religion is squarely challenged, head-on, at Muslimish events and in their various online spaces. So, to recap, some prominent support groups and communities. Well, there's the Ex-Muslims of North America, EXMNA, Muslimish, which uniquely allows questioning Muslims to join. And there's the pioneering Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain, CEMB. In fact, there are now groups that exist in almost every country in the world. Where there are Muslims, there are also ex-Muslims. And finally, there are various covert and underground groups in, yes, Islamic countries. Covert and underground for obvious reasons. For a more comprehensive list, please see the description box for this video for a link. Now, while there are many support communities, as I've just listed, if you're interested in my journey, it started with EXMNA, the Ex-Muslims of North America. They provided me with a sense of community in 2015 and the means to give back, to support others, and to do what I'm doing now. Religions do not have a monopoly on community. It is our human endowment. So please, remember this. The short vignette that follows is but a taste of the contentment that community and new friendships can bring, something I've experienced firsthand. So if you've left Islam, don't isolate yourself. A community is waiting for you. New friendships, full of understanding and acceptance, can be yours as well. In this Coming Out series, I'm also going to preview for you where I see opportunities for reclaiming community and synthesizing philosophy that can empower all of us. I believe that as human beings, we do thrive on structure. I also believe that we can do a far better job than the traditional religions that we have among us today. If religions are all man-made, then why not just admit that? And why not, this time, just do a better job? All right, I'm being slightly facetious here, but I do believe that together we can collaborate across the globe to create a beautiful blueprint for how to successfully live happy and fulfilling lives, all without having to buy into the unsubstantiated, supernatural claims of the religions we have effectively rejected and remixed. I see an opportunity for opt-in communities centered around some best practices for living that provide a positive identity around which to reclaim community and the legacy of human wisdom, which is, after all, our collective and rightful endowment as human beings. Now, since we won't all agree on the details, we'll create many such communities, working in harmony as part of a federation of philosophy communities. I am, however, getting ahead of myself. If you are keen to know more about my ideas on community and philosophy beyond the traditional religions that many of us are now leaving behind, well, you'll want to read my essay, Lessons Learned on Community and Dissent. There, among other topics, I provide a more detailed preview on how we'll build this together. More of that topic will be coming in the future. Since I've now come out publicly as both ex-Muslim and ex-Ahmadi, I know that a lot of my time in activism will be spent in the critique of Islam and deep in the weeds theological discussions. I'm ready for it. Many find it difficult to move forward until they've thoroughly dismantled the chains that have bound them for so long. Now, while I'm certainly over it, it would be selfish of me not to use the knowledge that I've gained to continue to help others who are struggling with Islam and its after effects. It would be selfish of me not to spend some time continuing to challenge the truth claims of Islam and of its apologists. But after I get comfortable with more public speaking, and after I've talked with people who've gone through similar journeys, I do plan to have conversations with believing Muslims, including devout Ahmadi Muslims. At some point in the future, however, I do know that my focus will shift from what I've left behind to what's next. As just mentioned, I plan to pen a treatise on how we can reclaim community and philosophy by creating new positive identities associated with prescriptive best practices for living. New frameworks for living set atop a clean canvas which make a clean break from the religions of the past. They'll touch upon multiple aspects of our lives. Around these, new communities will form. This, of course, isn't an endeavor that'll appeal to everyone. I get that. But I do believe that it'll resonate with the people who appreciate structure and building on the knowledge of the many wise teachers who've come before us. Think of it as a fusion encompassing Stoicism, contemplative practices, physical fitness, wholesome nutrition, community, and stories with powerful archetypes that we identify as just stories, but which nonetheless illustrate lessons and themes for life. We don't need to keep the Bible or any other holy book alive just because it contains some useful, albeit dubious, stories. That would be both irresponsible of us as well as an assault on objective truth. Instead, we'll create new stories. We'll clearly mark them as fiction, knowing that doing so does not diminish from the many lessons they'll be designed to impart. we may even roll in true stories that we can verify from history, as well as wisdom from religious philosophers of the past whose wisdom is universal and which holds just as well transplanted out of the soil of legacy religion. The philosophy communities that we'll create will pursue virtue, human welfare, human rights, personal responsibility, charity, knowledge, and in short, eudaimonia, as Aristotle put it. My treatise on the subject should be coming in the not-too-distant future. It will lay the groundwork and present the foundational ideas. That treatise will be a call for volunteers to assemble so that we can build this framework into which a diversity of philosophy communities can flourish. The philosophy communities will be built to recognize one another in a cooperative way. Now, I recognize that this vision may not come to fruition in my lifetime, but I have no doubt that this is where many of us and where future generations are headed. This is the path forward. Or should I say, it's one path forward for those who would like to have that option. Can we have our cake and eat it too? I believe the answer to that question is yes. This first video was not a treatise on why Islam is not true, although I touched on some of that. The purpose here was only to lay the groundwork for future content that will explore these ideas in much more depth. The goal here with this first video was primarily to emphasize that my message and the message of former Muslims like me is one of attacking ideas, not attacking people. We explore these ideas because we care about the people, and we also demand the same dignity that others enjoy whilst also getting to live authentic lives. Many in my audience will have started their journeys as believers, and they too will be inspired to question their indoctrination and their inherited beliefs. As they do, they will continue the dialogue and they will move it forward. And so this video message is not only an appeal to believing Muslims to ponder and to reflect, it is my effort to help set the tone with fellow ex-Muslims and fellow ex-Ahmadis on dialoguing with authenticity, with compassion, and with dignity. Now, while this concludes my very first video, stay tuned. My coming out address continues in subsequent videos. And if you'd like to follow my work, subscribe to this channel and follow my blog, reasononfaith.org. You can also find me on most social media platforms, such as Twitter, where I use the handle reasononfaith. This has been Reason on Faith, signing off. Peace.